This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L. W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
Part of the assignment for next class, there's two parts of it. One is do this optimizing a private farm exercise that's on the web. Okay, I don't know if has anybody done it yet? I think Allison did it. Is Allison? You did it, right? Right. So it's pretty straightforward, right? So the bottom line is the goal in doing the optimizing a private farm is to say you have a farm, you're a farmer, you have to figure out what's your goal? What would, if you're a farmer, what's your goal in terms of deciding how many cows to put on the farm? Let's say we're a milk farmer. So, you know, we're growing. We want to maximize the amount of milk, and the way you do it is by figuring out how many cows can go on this land at a rate at which the amount of food they eat doesn't impinge on each other, right? That you don't want to have too many, because you overgraze, right? And then you have to move on, which is happening on public lands all over the West, right? Because we have public lands that are not private farms. So you overgraze and then you move to the next plot of land. But if this is your private land, you've got to keep it going. You've got to sustain it over time. But you don't know how many it is. So you have to do trial and error, right? So you should, how many rounds did it take you, Allison? About 10, right? And that's actually, I mean, I've noticed over a lot of people play it. I just have it up on the web, and somehow people find it. And you know, they play it, and it's usually in that range. But if you want, you could try it, or you could try to make it more interesting for yourself by trying to say, okay, I know Allison did 10. Can I beat her, right? Can you think through a strategy by which, how's the quickest way to hone in on a central number that's the optimum number? You know, and it'll tell you when you get to the optimal number. The easiest way is to ask Allison, right? Because she's in the next farm over, and ask her how many cows she put on hers. But so try that. But the bottom line is to say, think how easy that problem is relative to the same problem, or a very similar problem, when you have a lot of people involved. Okay, that's what the tragedy of the commons is about. Okay. Second is the discussion paper. The description of the assignment is on the syllabus. Okay, has everybody looked at it? Or I mean, at least looked at the assignment? So you know what it is? Any questions about it? 1,200 words, seriously. Okay? Maximum of 1,200 words, no more. Yep. That's the little, for those of you who are not scientifically notated, that's a little less than sign. Must be less than 1,200 words. Okay, not more than. And bring in, I don't say it on there, bring in 2 copies, please. Print out 2 copies, because I will grade one. That is what you will receive your grade on. The other, a senior, a really excellent student, senior will be not grading them. The grade won't matter. We'll be giving you writing feedback, okay, for the writing in the major class. So just improving your writing more generally. You know, structure, content, prose, everything else. The stuff that I'm not going to waste time on. I will waste time on content, okay? And Negar Azimi, some of you may know her, will give you feedback on your writing, and she really writes really well. That's why I chose her. So make sure you have the discussion papers ready. That should help you think about the game and think about your strategy. And I'm having you write this paper before before we go through that process, because I want you to take the readings that you have to take. You shouldn't have to do additional research. Just, think it through and try to own it. I think the main thing is owning it, is making sure you understand what a tragedy of the commons is so you can explain it to somebody else and what's your understanding of it. Last thing is, just make sure your calendars are marked for Saturday, March 10th when we're going to do the simulation, the all-day simulation. Okay, it's on the syllabus, but I want to kind of bring it to your attention, make sure it gets transferred to your scheduling book so that you don't schedule a nice ski weekend. Okay, you can do that Sunday. But Saturday, March 10th will be the simulation. I would really prefer, I have an alternative for those who can't make it, but I've tried to make it hard. I tried to make it unattractive because I want people to show up. If you have, I mean, there are people who have real life entering into their lives, and you have to do that, and that's fine. And that's why I give an alternative, but do plan on being there on Saturday. Okay, any questions, comments, things like that? Okay, what I want to do today then is go through, briefly cover 5 perspectives as a sort of overview, and that those 5 perspectives will then, I'll do 3 of them today, and then 2 more on will be involved in Thursday's class because they're very closely related to the tragedy of the commons. And the first we actually kind of did yesterday, so I won't go, I mean not yesterday, Thursday, Steve did it, was a scientific perspective. And these are my own kind of categories. Some other people use things similar, but I'll just lay them out to give you a sense of what I see as 5 different ways people approach environmental problems. One is scientific. This is sort of why I had Steve come in. Speaking of which, you should all know. Again, you should be reading the New York Times. The Shanghai meeting that Steve talked about has come out. It's very good news. Now it looks like global temperatures could rise as much as 10.5 degrees. So it's getting worse. The assessments of where we're going, what the trajectory looks like, is getting worse. Don't have kids. I mean, the prospects do not seem good. There's growing consensus that there's a worse problem out there. So that's one that we talked about, and I'll lay out the others as well. Scientific. A second is what I call ecophilosophical, and this involves a large group, but I'll talk about it in a second. A third is political. A fourth is economic. And a fifth is legal. Okay, what I see as 5 different perspectives, and you kind of hear these different perspectives when you hear people talk about environmental issues. Essentially, and I'll give just a brief overview of these before going into a kind of somewhat more in-depth one on scientific to get out some issues that I don't think Steve raised, because actually Steve does not fit as neatly into this little box as one would imagine most scientists do. Then I'll go through ecophilosophical and political today, and then we'll talk about these on Thursday. But essentially the way I see scientists, or a scientific perspective, is that the problem, why do we have environmental problems? And for each of these I'll lay out what's the problem and what does that imply as the solution. For a scientist, for a lot of scientists, or those who take a scientific perspective, the problem is a lack of knowledge. The reason we have environmental problems is because we don't know about them. We don't know what the causal relationships are. We don't understand that when we drain or when we have a leak in our coolant, not our coolant, our air conditioning system in our car, or our refrigerator busts, and we don't have any more any more Freon in there. We don't realize for a good 55 years, 65 years, that those little Freon things, Freon being the brand name for CFCs, sit around, they go up into the atmosphere over Antarctica and blow a hole and combine at very high levels in the atmosphere, in the stratosphere actually, where they combine, they cause catalytic reactions that destroy ozone, okay? Seems reasonable that we wouldn't know that. In fact, if you want to know, in terms of the process of scientific knowledge, why were CFCs used and so widely used originally? Because they did no environmental harm. Because in fact, they were very environmentally friendly relative to the other things that were being used. How many of you ever lived on a boat? Okay, what's your refrigerant on a boat? Either of you know? Well, for most boats, it's propane. That you can compress propane in the same way you compress CFCs and then decompress it later, okay? So you can use propane or you can use ammonia, okay? Both can do the same function. But propane, as it turns out, has one problem. What is it? Don't smoke nearby when it springs a leak, right? Tends to be very hazardous to human health if there's an accident. Ditto for ammonia, right? Ammonia can kill you very quickly if you're in a room filled with ammonia, okay? CFCs, you can suck on the end of a pipe of CFCs till the cows come home, and as long as you're getting enough oxygen in your brain, you'll be fine. It's a very inert substance. That's what was great about it. It doesn't react with anything. That ends up being the problem. It doesn't react with anything, so it can migrate all the way from southern LA, where your car springs a leak in the air conditioning system, and migrate all the way up till 10 years later, it's up above the South Pole, blowing holes in the ozone. Okay, so this lack of knowledge about what the consequences of human behavior are is part of the problem. What's the solution? What's the scientist's response to everything? 2 words: more research. Right? That we have to solve the problem by doing more research about it. These scientists, we just spent, if you think about this, they're in Shanghai, China, right? So figure, I don't know how many people are there. Figure there's 3,000 people. 3,000 more air flights, right? And if you want to go figure out what does more damage to the climate than anything else, if you look at your kind of personal CO2 budget, just put in another plane flight each year and you'll see how it just kind of doubles and triples the amount of CO2 you're producing as a human being. So these guys are producing this problem as, when they go out to provide a report about what the problem is, right? So I think you want to think about, does knowing more about the problem solve it? And yes and no. I think there's a good argument to be made for yes, that's certainly a necessary condition. If we don't know there's a problem, we can't even start to fix it, right? And there's lots of problems that are out there that we don't yet know about, okay? There's problems such as the amount of nitrogen we're fixing in the soil. That we're just beginning to understand what's the long-term impacts of excessive fixing of nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil, right? Those sorts of things. And there's 10 we don't even know what the names of the problems are yet, right? We don't yet know how cotton causes cancer, right? That's what we're going to find out 20 years from now, that cotton clothing, natural clothing, or hemp, right? To take the most hippy-dippy sort of natural environmental version, hemp actually will cause cancer in anybody who wears it for more than 5 minutes at a stretch, right? We don't yet know that, and that's the problem, is that all these things that we didn't know about come back and bite us later, okay? So science says knowledge is the problem and more knowledge is the solution, or kind of an inadequacy of knowledge is the problem, more knowledge is the solution. Ecophilosophical, and this is a kind of clump of different sort of bioregionalism, Gaia principle, ecofeminist theories, deep ecology, all of the sort of what in America would be considered the far left of the political spectrum in general. The hardcore, the deep green, sort of hardcore environmentalists, I clump here, just to, not that they all think alike, and indeed they have quite different views of the world, but I think the way I see them is an eco-philosophical view says, if here the kind of main concept is knowledge for scientists, here the main concept is values. The reason why we harm the environment is that we have the wrong values. We don't care enough about it, okay? And that we need to care more about the environment if we're going to start to fix it. Okay, so the values, so if this is, we have, our knowledge is wrong and we have to get the right knowledge to solve it, here our values are wrong and we have to get the right values if we're going to solve it. Okay, that's sort of an eco-philosophical approach. A political approach really says something slightly different. A political approach says that those with power, it essentially says that the 2 key concepts here are power and interest, or power and incentives. that those with power don't have the right incentives to protect the environment, and those with the incentives to protect the environment don't have the power. Okay? Think of an eco-justice, an environmental justice kind of argument that says the reason that we're going to be shoving nuclear waste down Yucca Mountain in Nevada is because the people who live there and the people for whom that land is sacred, et cetera, don't have the power to prevent it from being used that way. And the people who have the power to prevent it from being used that way have no interest in protecting the environment. Okay? So that's, I think, a third one. Fourth is economic view of the world, that prices are what drive behavior. And the problem, the reason we harm the environment is because the price of harming the environment is too low. And all you have to do is get prices right. Okay? I mean, I think one of the thing that's kind of gets me going every evening these days is this whole the power thing going on, right? There's an easy answer. I mean, I believe enough in the economic view of the world to say there's an easy answer to this problem. Charge $10 a kilowatt hour, and people will conserve energy, as it turns out. Right now, they're paying 2 and 3 cents a kilowatt hour. You want to get people to conserve energy, charge them for it, right? And why would you want to charge them for it? What's the real reason? Because, in fact, the amount of energy we use is causing this problem, right? It's an externality. We'll talk about that a little bit. But right, our low price of energy lead us to overuse energy, which causes global warming, which will wipe out Vanuatu and Tuvalu and all the islands in the South Pacific. It will also, cause changes in agriculture, all the problems due to global warming. So we're putting a cost on people in the future, right? On our great-great-grandchildren. We're imposing a cost of a 10-degree increase in global temperature on our grandchildren because we want to have low prices for energy, right? So I think, so the economist's view on this would be simple, right? And if you want to read it, read the Paul Krugman articles that are every few days in the op-ed page of the New York Times, where he talks about an economist's view of various things, but he often comments on environmental issues. But all you need to do is charge people $20 a gallon for gas, right? And $10 a gallon, $10 a kilowatt hour for electricity. Now, some of you may say, wait a minute, but then my power bill goes up. Very good, but what can you do? You use less power. You turn off the lights. You don't get film crews in here turning on these really high energy lights, right? You turn down everything. You avoid the cost by reducing your use of that and using some other product or some other, like a sweater, for example, in the house, right? You put on a sweater and turn down your thermostat a few degrees. All of these things, so you push things around by prices. So prices are a problem. You get prices right, you fix the problem. And the last one, not surprisingly, law, and the half of you that don't become economists will become lawyers. And you'll think that the whole solution is that we have the wrong laws, and all we have to do is get the laws right, and then everything will be hunky-dory, right? So that's sort of an overview. And I think if you look at when people talk about what's the environmental problem and how do we solve it, I think you can kind of see these things playing out. Nobody's only one of these. Very rarely do you find somebody who's precisely one of these, but you find people who combine various and sundry of these. I think a lot of the tragedy of commons debate is about this, about how do you get legal structures right such that pricing is right, okay? But you see a lot of these. So let's then talk for a bit. Do anybody have questions or comments about just the basic structure here? Okay, it's one way to think about it. There will be alternatives. But let's start with just a brief overview of what kind of Steve talked around about on Thursday. Is a scientific perspective. The first thing I want to say, and I think Steve mentioned it, I think some of you may have a different perspective than Schneider has, which is Steve was sort of saying, well, there's values involved in all science. But I think there's a lot of people out there who believe the values are deeply embedded, and much more deeply embedded than Steve would have allowed, right? That scientists don't have a lock on some sort of objective reality out there. That the values, the notion of a scientific method, the notion that we can have objective knowledge, and we'll talk about this when I go to the ecophilosophical approach, that's the problem. It's precisely this thing that here's humans here and here's nature there, and we separate the two and we observe and we're not involved and we don't feel emotional bonding with the environment. All of that stuff is the problem, not the solution to our environmental woes. So one is that values are involved in all science, but it doesn't mean that science is just as self-interested as politics. Scientists have the political view. Politics is just saying, follow your interests, right? With whatever power at your disposal. Science says, well, people are like that. People will probably follow their interests with the power available to them. But there's a set of rules you have to follow to do good science. You have to, make it replicable. You have to follow the scientific method, which most of you have learned at least in 7th grade science class, if not more since, right? You know what the scientific method is. And what's the scientific method try to do? What would some of you say is kind of what's the goal of the scientific method? Why should we trust it more than trusting me just going out there and saying, I went out there today, feels like global warming to me. Warm day, warmer than I remember it with my faulty memory being a few years back. Seems like global warming. Why don't we spend billions of dollars to fix this problem? Why not? Make it trillions. Why think small? Right? That's even approaching the scientific method, isn't it? What did I do that's sort of scientific method? I went outside, right? For starters, I went outside and I compared it to what it used to be, right? I kind of created a trend line, right? Okay, but what does the scientific method really try to do? What do some of you see as the kind of major things of the scientific method, major benefits? I mean, there are lots of costs to the scientific method too, but most of us are stuck in this very Western notion of knowledge that is very scientifically based. We give a lot of legitimacy to science. So let's talk the good side. Malika.
It's replicable.
Okay.
Experimental.
And what does that mean?
That is, if you're a scientist and you go find out something, then you can come show me the exact same thing.
Okay.
And prove to me that it's not just your subjective opinion.
Okay. Others? Either building on that or other values of it?
Collects a wide variety of information, so you can, and allows for people to step back and look at that information.
Okay. Collects a wide variety of information. Other elements?
You test your hypothesis supposedly a bunch of times to get the same answer. Okay.
So we see whether it's just due to random chance or due to kind of something that happens consistently, right? I mean, if you flip a quarter, Steve was talking about a quarter being flipped. If you flip it enough times, every once in a while, it will land on edge, right? I mean, if you flipped it a billion times, it's likely that the quarter will, once in a while, land on edge, right? And so we can't just say it's a 50-50 chance, right? It's a 49.9999999 chance of heads, 49.99999 chance of tails, and a 0.0001 chance of landing on its edge, right? So we want to know what those things are over a large number of cases. Okay, anything else?
If you want to explain a situation, you'll try different hypotheses until it finally works.
Okay.
Like the pursuit of knowledge is superior to your own opinions. So
until it finally works. What do you mean until it finally works? What's the it?
Until your hypothesis is correct.
Is that what we do in science? Do it until we get the answer we wanted at the beginning? No, that sounds like politics to me. I'm sorry, that's the wrong report. Go back and write it over until you give me the answer I asked you for,
sorry,
right?
Until the experiment comes out with
a clear answer.
Yeah.
Even if it's contrary to what we want, right?
Yeah.
I mean, politics is the process of saying, here's the answer I want, I'm going to give you a question, come back with that answer, right? And that's not explicitly done, but usually, a political report is by definition that kind of report. You know what the answer is, you ask a question, you say, come back with that answer. A scientific report says what? And this is sort of my view of what the difference between analysis and advocacy is. I'm going to push you a lot to do analysis. Advocacy is a hugely important social process. I would welcome all of you becoming advocates in the real world. I think you should know how to do analysis, which I think is different. Okay? Advocacy, there's a lot of important skills to doing advocacy. I have no idea what they are. I can't teach them to you. I don't try to teach them. What I do try to teach is analysis. The difference between analysis and advocacy is captured, in my view, by the scientific method. The difference is that an analyst tries to prove themselves wrong. Okay? An advocate always tries to prove themselves right. That's why I jumped on Emily when she said, that you want to try to prove yourself wrong. So you set out setting up a hypothesis which, if you can't prove that it's more than outside that 95% confidence interval that you all should know from scientific studies, right? Unless it's outside that, we're going to say it's due to chance, right? We're going to make it very hard to believe that that something is different than we expected, okay? We're going to say only if it's way outside, right? Outside the 95% confidence interval do we believe that it's correct. Do people follow that? So you're making it hard for yourself. I mean, to give you a social science example of that, I wanted to show 10 years ago when I was doing my PhD research, the big argument in the field of IR was, do treaties make a difference? Do regimes make a difference? Okay? And there were the realists, all of you who've taken 35 should kind of recognize this argument, the realists who said, hey, treaties are what states agreed to do. No surprise we should see them doing it, right? That is, they agreed to do what they were planning on doing anyway, then they proceeded to do what they were planning on doing anyway. The treaties don't add any value here. They're just a kind of codification of what the states were planning on doing anyway. When they do it, we shouldn't be surprised that there's high compliance. On the other hand, you see, so that was, on the other hand, were those, the institutionalists, the Bob Cohans of the world, who said, no, there are institutions that make a difference, that change state behavior. States behave differently than they would otherwise. And so I said, well, okay, I want to try to contribute to that argument, to that debate. I want to kind of help come down on one side or the other of that. I was an institutionalist. I had been trained by Bob Cohan, so I had been kind of, brainwashed to believe his view of the world was right. So I already wanted to do that. But I didn't do what Emily said, which is go out and try to prove my point. What I did was I said, where's a case where the realist would be most likely to be right? Where's a case where it's least likely that a treaty would make a difference? Because if I can show that the treaty made a difference in that case, then I have a powerful case, right? So what I did was I said, where would treaties be least likely to make a difference? Well, in kind of regulating the behavior of really powerful actors, right? Of very concentrated actors, of a very relatively few actors, and big, powerful actors who are relatively concentrated, who incur a lot of costs, and then therefore have a strong incentive to resist being regulated. So what I did was I thought about that, and what would be one sort of sector where you would expect to be the most powerful? Well, oil companies. They're kind of a pretty powerful, pretty concentrated set of actors in the international realm. So what I wanted to do was look at regulation of oil pollution. Was it likely that I would see those oil companies change their behavior in response to international law? No, highly unlikely. But I wanted to look there because if I did find that they changed their behavior, and I could convincingly show it, then I could say, hey, treaties make a difference sometimes even when you least expect it. Now we can generalize that more widely, okay? So that's sort of the kind of perspective. And the value goes back to what Malika raised, which is this sense of, I have enough faith that what I did, in the process I used to do it, to say, any of the others of you, I could give you a set of rules to follow about how you collect data, how you interpret data, etc. And I don't care what your biases are. If you follow those rules, you'll come out with the same answer as I did. That's the objectivity about it, okay? Is this sense that I can give you a set of rules, and I don't know what your answer will be. I can give you a set of rules to follow, and if you follow those rules, I will trust your answer. In fact, that's what I'm doing in this class. Hopefully I'm going to get 20 papers back that follow a set of rules, and then I can trust your answers and say, hey, this treaty that Deanna studied doesn't work, and this one that Ashley studied does. Because you followed a set of rules that I believe and I trust as a basis for knowledge, okay? So that's the scientific perspective. Obviously, though, as an institutionalist, guess what my PhD thesis proved? That institutions matter, right? I did look hard for that. I tried to make it hard for myself, but you can see a kind of pattern that institutionalists tend to find institutions work, and realists tend to find they don't. So there's clearly some bias slipping in, and that's just as true in the hard sciences as well. People do, you want to find environmental damage from some factory, you'll find it. You'll just keep looking until you find it. You keep redefining what you mean by environmental damage until if you don't find cancer, you'll find systemic health problems, you'll find, glaucoma, you'll find hearing problems, you'll find anything you can to show that this thing does damage. So I think, well, you try to resist that, hopefully. But it does slip in. It's hard to resist those human biases that we come with. What are the role of scientists in the process? Well, one, they're trend spotters. they look at how things go together. They try to say, hey, wow, it's getting warmer. Or, the ozone hole is getting larger every year. Or, AIDS rates are increasing in southern Africa. Or whatever it is, right? Malaria rates are increasing. Any of those things. So you see trends. Scientists help us see trends. They also build theories about where those trends come from. What's the independent variable that's causing that to happen? So we saw a trend, which is global climate change, but we didn't know what it was coming from. And then people start saying, maybe it has to do with industrial emissions, right? You build a theory about what CO2 does once it gets into the atmosphere. You start collecting data on emissions of, burning of coal and fossil fuels. And you start saying, hey, does that correlate with this increase in temperature? Okay, so they build theories for us. They test those theories. They go out and check and make sure they're right. Okay? They also then, a lot of them serve as science communicators, okay? Brokers between the science world and the policy world, the kind of, in this case, like people like Bob Watson, who's the chair of the IPCC, kind of reporting out. This whole process is one of communicating really hard, intense science that nobody in this room could understand about climate change and making it so that people like us could understand it, right? So there's this process of trying to communicate. Often not particularly well. The process can be very difficult to communicate. Guess what happens? If you want to read this report, will it say a 10% could rise by as much as 10.5 degrees? Well, this is what Steve was saying, right? Remember when he had his little map that was all red and orange, right? He was saying, give me the high end, right? This reporter wants to communicate to policymakers, wants to communicate with an agenda about that climate change is a bad thing and we should work on it. But all of the IPCC reports are things like this, right? Are sort of ranges of stuff, ranges of estimates. And then we're going to say, look, see? 10.5 degrees, right? And down here is, actually the range probably goes something like this, right? And here's a negative 10.5 degrees, but we'll still say could go to a maximum of 10.5 degrees, right? There's that process of trying to communicate complex information to simple-minded politicians, right? And to people where it's just, it's a complex world, there's a lot going on, you're trying to make sense of it all. And you have to keep it as simple and powerful as possible. Okay, so there's this process of science communication. So in 1988, Jim Hansen from, big scientist, went down to the Hill. It was a warm summer. He said climate change and kind of attributed the warm summer to climate change. Now, most scientists would not have agreed with him about that. But it was a powerful political moment, in this process of communicating science to policymakers in order to make a change. So they play an important role there. And then a lot of times you can have scientists as real policymakers, right? You can have the president has usually had both science advisors over the last 20, I think actually Kennedy was the first one to have a science advisor, but just a scientist who's on White House staff who helps them understand the science regularly, but is also making science policy about, important questions about the next $1 billion that the National Research Council or the National Academy of Sciences or National Science Foundation hands out. Should it go to climate change or should it go to nitrogen fixing in the soil? It's an important thing because what we'll know 10 years from now and 20 years from now will depend on that science, right? So we know more about schistosomiasis, right? And other diseases that affect third world, developing country people? Probably not, because we're not going to spend money trying to understand that process, right? So those sorts of policy priorities getting set about how we spend science money are going to have long-term impacts. Just two last things. In all of this, there's huge uncertainty. Any of you have done any research at all? When I talk about 95% confidence intervals, that means I'm going to declare something to be true, and I still might be wrong 5% of the time, right? That's what that means. So therefore, you have to say, well, we're dealing with uncertainty. What do we do when we're uncertain? Do we know that climate change is occurring? Are we sure? Are we 100% positive climate change is occurring? No. So the question then is, are we going to make policy decisions in the face of that knowledge? Yeah, because even not making a policy decision is making a policy decision to continue business as usual, right? So therefore, we have to understand at least two different approaches to uncertainty. And uncertainty is a huge part. I won't go into it much, but you can think of two different approaches. One is a no regrets principle. This was Bush the senior talked about this a lot. A no regrets policy with respect to climate change. What would a no regrets policy be? Good. I see a lot of you actually have the notes from the web. Those of you who don't should be able to know that they're available, so you can just annotate, really write it all down. Alex.
You're taking action and you really don't know the full value of the problem, but you're taking action anyways just in case the problem might occur in the future.
Okay, is that a no regrets policy? Versus, because we're going to have an alternative policy, which is precautionary principle. I won't ask you. I'll just tell you that that's closer to a precautionary principle. Is it Megan, sorry, Megan.
It strikes me more of a, well, we can't change what we've already done, so we're not going to worry about it.
Okay. One is we can't change what we've already done, but what's the other part? A no regrets policy. Part of this no regrets policy, and I start realizing many of you are probably too young to have been a kind of conscious and sentient adults during the first Bush's term. So, I mean, does anybody...
Maybe like upping taxes on fossil fuels, but to create better energy, which would be economic anyway, like to have a better energy source.
Okay, very good, right, exactly. Things that we should be doing anyway because we want to get off of the OPEC, out of the OPEC trough, so that we're not so reliant on OPEC, right? So we should be having a policy that makes sense economically for other reasons, right? That we should be conserving energy because it makes sense to conserve energy, right? We should be making more efficient computers because it reduces our costs and allows us to make more profit in GNP, whatever, right? Those sorts of, no regrets policies that are doing things that are worth doing anyway, and you need a catalyst to do them. Emily. What? You just got it? Okay. So what's the problem with that basic idea of a no regrets policy?
Not all environmental problems seem to make economic sense or sense in other areas.
A major problem from an environmental perspective is, hey, you're going for what makes short-term sense, and precisely most environmental problems don't make short-term sense to solve. Right? That it requires a long-term perspective. What else is wrong with it? How many of you have taken economics classes? How many of you have walked outside? How many $5 bills are there out on the sidewalk? Right? Why not? Because people already picked up all the $5 bills that are blowing around on the sidewalk, right? A no regrets policy says there's lots of $5 bills out there just waiting to be done that we should be doing anyway, right? But we haven't done them. But there shouldn't be many, if the economy works at all efficiently, $5 bills should already have been picked up, right? So the one way to kind of square that circle is this notion that a no regrets policy is something that there's an inertia in the system, that there's things we haven't done because we kind of got stuck on a certain path. And we need something to shift past, a catalyst to get us to kind of jog ourselves out of doing what makes more sense, right? That that whenever you move into a new house, you walk into a new, place you're renting, and there's at least four things that really bug you about the way the house is laid out, right? That the light switch, you have to jiggle it twice and then push up to get the light to turn on, or whatever it is. You all have those kinds of problems. And you fix those, but you realize the person before didn't fix them. Why? Because they broke slowly and over time, right? And it's only because you move in and you see this big change. For them, it was very inefficient to move the light switch 2 times and then push up. 2, it was inefficient for them, but they never fixed it because it was too much effort to fix it. But for you moving in new, you say, okay, I'm going to make the effort to fix things and get them right. And it would have made more sense for them to do it too. But there's an inertia to all of our systems. There's inertia to social systems. We should shift to a solar economy. We should do all those things. But it's just we're on this one path and we have to shift over and we need something to kind of give us that extra boost, right? So that it may be hard to get a gas tax in this country. And everybody says we should have it, right? It would be actually a good idea to tax bad things like gasoline and driving, right? And stop taxing good things like people working, right? Income tax is a tax on working, right? The more you work, the more you pay. So we should stop taxing good things that we want people to do, like work. We should start taxing bad things. You need something to push it over. Maybe environment can be another argument to help push you over to getting a tax on gasoline. So that might help, right? So that's no regrets. A precautionary principle says, no, we don't have to be certain about anything. Let's take actions before we know what the answer is, before we know whether there's going to be climate change, right? And most environmentalists would tend towards this precautionary principle view of the world, right? We don't know, but there's a lot of scary things out there in the future, and we should try to avoid all of them, right? That makes sense, doesn't it? Does that make sense to people? That we should try to should we spend some money on climate change that we're not sure will happen? I certainly think so. Other people think so. Should we spend money? How much?
It depends on the degree of uncertainty.
Okay. How much uncertainty? Until it's just right for you?
Well, and it depends on how much money you're talking about too, of course.
Okay. Good. So talk to me about the money part.
Well, if there's a relatively high degree of uncertainty and you're talking about a large amount of money, then I'm going to say the chances aren't very good that you're going to spend that. You know, but if there's a small degree of uncertainty and a relatively small amount of money, you know, we could be talking billions, but it depends on the size of the problem. Then, of course, there's a higher degree of action.
Okay, so that's, and what's nice, what's Deanna, right? Diana, sorry. What Diana just laid out is nice is she talked about it in a descriptive way. She wasn't talking about what she thought was a good idea. She was saying what's likely to happen. I think that's an important thing to differentiate between. Hers was an explanatory and a descriptive argument, not a normative argument about what we should do, but about what she predicts. She says, if there's a large uncertainty and it's going to cost a lot, there's a large price tag, large uncertainty about something bad happening, and a large price tag today about what we have to do to avoid that happening, not likely to pay, right? Now, what's your normative argument, Diana, sorry. I will get it right by the end of the term.
I would say that even if there's a high degree of uncertainty, but the eventual outcome is, you know, extraordinarily negative, then even if there's a high price tag, we should pay it.
Okay.
Precautionary.
Okay. Which is basically the precautionary principle, right? It's what are called high probability, high disutility events, okay? That is, things that are, or even low probability, high disutility events, right? That is not likely to happen, but if they happen, they're really bad. For example, nuclear war, right? That is a low probability, high disutility event, right? Lower probability now than it used to be. But we're still willing to pay a significant premium to avoid it, right? What's it called these days? NMD, right? National Missile Defense, Star Wars, right? We're talking about, with this new change in administration, spending a lot of money, right? Exactly in the same manner as, it's a precautionary principle applied to nuclear weaponry, right? Low probability event, the likelihood of a rogue nation actually using a ballistic missile to launch a nuclear attack against the United States, given that the best way to get nuclear missiles into this country is to pack it in a packet of cocaine, right? We know cocaine can get in fine. You can get it anywhere you want in this country. All you got to do is put a nuclear missile inside that, and you're good to go. Why ballistic missile it over the border, right? That seems like a waste of time. Okay, so it's a low probability event, high disutility. It would be a drag if San Francisco blew up over, had a nuclear weapon go off over it, right? But we're willing to spend, or at least we're in the process of having a policy discussion about how much should we spend to avoid that low probability, high disutility event, right? Then you want to compare that, so we're using very much a precautionary principle in the nuclear world, and we did for years, right? The whole Cold War was a process of spending tons of money on essentially a precautionary principle towards nuclear war, right? In the environmental field, people don't like to use that approach to say, hey, it's a insurance premium, right? Let's pay some money up front to avoid something that may or may not happen in the future, but if it happened, it would be really bad. Okay, that's what we're talking about. And so but the problem lies in what Diana was saying, which is, well, it depends on two things. It depends on what's the probability and what's the cost. Okay, and it's actually what's the cost of today's cost and what's the cost avoided. That is, what's the problem in the future, not both how likely it is, but how hard is it going to be. So that's just to say that, okay, in thinking about these things and comparing them, we need to think about if we do this, one of the problems, if we follow a precautionary principle or precautionary approach, one of the problems is that we spend a lot of money today for something that might not have happened in the future, right? We might be wrong. Why might we be wrong? Because our science is wrong. Our science told us it was climate change, and it turns out that the thing that's caused it, that it was CO2 emissions, turns out the real problem is, I think of some bizarre, it's the amount of rap music we're playing that actually is destroying, is contributing to global warming, whatever it is. Yeah, Eli.
I just had one question. Why do you think it's so much harder? Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, but it seems like the whole Star Wars thing, to avoid a cost in the future, you have to basically spend like 100% of the money today, like set up the system. Whereas in global warming, you don't have to spend like 100% of what it is, just taking like a small incremental cost will help save a lot in the future. Mm-hmm. And it just seems like everyone's so much more willing to spend mitigate 100% of something that they don't know is going to happen, as compared to only spending a little bit of something they don't know is going to happen either.
Okay, so sort of the question is why are we willing to use a precautionary principle for national missile defense but not for environmental issues? Because the cost should even be lower in the environmental sphere. Yeah, no, a good question, and I think that nice segue actually. So let me use that as a segue to the next to an eco-philosophical approach, because I think the answer lies in what the philosophers would say, right? Is a sense that it's about values. It's about what we care about. So let's switch there. So thinking about an eco-philosophical approach, and there are a lot of this, but I think most of us, or certainly the norm in the culture, is what most people in the field would call shallow ecology. There's a guy, a Norwegian, called Arne Næss. I believe he's still alive, but he's getting quite old. Made this distinction between shallow ecology and deep ecology. Shallow ecology is certainly in America is the norm, okay? I mean, to the extent there's ecology at all, an ecological vision at all, it's a shallow ecology that it's in our own interest to protect the environment. That we should protect the environment because if we don't, it harms us. So that, like I have in the notes, a mosquito eradication program is evidence of a shallow ecology, right? We're more than happy to get rid of all species of mosquitoes. Not even checking how many species there are. We're willing to decimate all mosquito populations, no matter what species. We're willing to get rid of that biological diversity because it helps humans, right? So we're willing to trade off this sense of, no, we're not just part of nature, then we have to live with it. We'll get rid of those parts of nature we don't like that impinge on our well-being, okay? So there's this sense of sort of environment protected when it benefits humans. Okay, that's what you can call shallow ecology, or what Næss called shallow ecology. There's sort of a sort of the next level of it is sort of the shallowest ecology is when it protects current humans. The next deep level would be when we're willing to worry about future humans a little bit, okay? Children as extension of ourselves, right? Worrying about our grandchildren, all of these issues of kind of this, all the famous quotes from Native Americans about, that we don't own the land, we borrow it from our ancestors, or we inherit it from our ancestors and pass it on to our children. Those sorts of things, but it's focused on humans. This is essentially an anthropocentric view of the world. Humans are the center of the world, and the nature and the environment is here for our use. Okay, to the extent it is not useful to us, get rid of it. To the extent it's useful, use it. There's sort of a medium ecology view. Næss doesn't talk about a medium ecology view, but a medium ecology view, I'd put something like Wapner's readings. The readings you did for today are kind of a medium ecology, where Wapner is making an argument that it's bad because it's another way by which powerful actors harm the powerless, right? There's this process by which powerful actors use the environment and displace their environmental burdens onto others, right? So that one of the externalities of climate change is you and I drove into work today, we flew home for vacation. Who's going to bear those costs? Not merely our grandchildren, but the grandchildren of people in all kinds of other countries where we don't worry about them, right? Like, how many countries can you name in Africa, most of you, right? I mean, we don't even think about countries in Africa. There's just kind of Africa over there, right? You know, it doesn't even have countries for most Americans, right? It's just Africa. You know, it's still the dark continent for most Americans. You know, the sense of, and why, we're not worried about the people who live there today. Why should we be worried about the people who live there 100, 200, 300 years from now, right? And they should have a very strong lack of, we should have very little credibility with those people when we say, we're worried about climate change because we're worried about your grandchildren. They should be saying, yeah, give me some money today. I'll take care of my grandchildren. Thank you very much, right? That should be their response to us saying we're worried about what your future, because we're not worried about their present. How can we be worried about their future? But the third is, I think, is this deep ecology. And again, this is sort of a cocktail party introduction to a few different eco-philosophical approaches. Arne Naess pushed a deep ecology view of the world that essentially said, we have an ethical obligation to other species and all natural things. That that the problem is that we see ourselves that in a shallow ecology view or a non-ecological view, we see ourselves as separate from the natural world. We need to, in fact, see ourselves. We need to expand our notions of selves so it includes the natural world. That when a tree dies, I have to feel pain, right? Because I feel a sense of that's part of myself that's dying when that tree dies, right? So, I mean, the sort of, I mean, in a sense, the Julia Butterfly Hills of the world, right, have adopted this deep ecology view. That it was painful to her when Luna got cut, right? So this notion of, an extended notion of self, okay? And this is what Naess is pushing. And I think this is, the other difference is, here, Naess is pushing this notion of being self-regarding, being selfish, but having an extended notion of self, right? That is, we're selfish. We want to protect ourselves from harm. Now what we have to do is extend that protect ourselves from harm by saying, who is ourselves that we're protecting? And if ourselves include the environment, then we will protect the environment from harm as well, which is a different view of it than saying, nature's out there and I have to be other regarding. I have to protect that, right? It's not being selfish, it's being altruistic in a shallow ecology view to take care of the environment. Naess is saying, no. Just, you know, break down our notions, our traditional notions of self, expand new notions of self that say, here's how we protect the environment by having expanded notion of self, and then we act self-interestedly in response to that expanded notion of self. Just to say, actually, I just did a book review by a guy named Matt Patterson, who sort of tries to bring in an eco-philosophical view into IR. This is way out of the mainstream in standard international relations, right? This is all, it's not even poo-pooed. People don't even know about it, right? It's so disrespected, nobody even knows that it exists, right? In mainstream IR. And I think there are some people who are trying to bring it in. You see Wapner, but Wapner makes a fairly mediocre effort to really bring in deep green, deep ecology, right? But people like Patterson are starting to bring this in. I think it's a challenging book because it does that, because it sort of tries to give some bite or bring in deep ecology in a way that gets it to be taken seriously. I doubt it will be. I think a lot of the IR hierarchy, which is in fact largely white men and to some lesser degree white women who control the agenda in IR, will not by self-consciously but unself-consciously keep this stuff out and not allow it into the journals, etc. So there will be it will be marginalized. There's very much a sense of not man in the environment, not the dichotomy of man in the environment, but a more holistic view. That all life is to be valued, kind of, and the diversity of life is to be valued. All this stuff is parts of a sort of deep ecology view of the world. And essentially moving to an ecocentrism, an ecocentric view of the world, okay? In ecofeminist view, and then there are very many other approaches. You probably actually know more of them than I do. I mean, there's sort of Gaia principle stuff. There's bioregionalism. But I think the bottom line is they all share this notion that our values are wrong, that our environmental problems stem from our values. I mean, a short thing on ecofeminism. that essentially the causes of our environmental problems and the solution, or the causes of them, are the alienation of humans from the earth, that there's this process by which human, and particularly male, that the domination of the earth, the destruction of the earth, the domination of it, the control of it, all of those are a reflection of this, of fear, essentially, of male fear of the natural world. There's this fear and resentment causes males to dominate nature, including women. So the relationship between men and nature is the same as the relationship between men and women. That's the argument here. And that this leads to this whole hierarchy, militarism, a sort of industrialized, mechanistic, scientific view of the world that tries to control it, to reduce the fear, the anxiety that comes from a world that can't be controlled, in an attempt to control it, all those processes. And there's a large, and ecofeminists make a parallel between this domination of women that we see quite clearly being the same kind of dynamic playing out with humans and male response to nature. Okay, so there's this process of dominating nature and women in the same ways. And ecofeminists call for a new philosophical underpinning of civilization, a kind of much more radical change in the way we view the world, in the way we respond to each other and we respond to the natural world, etc. So again, a different view than the deep ecology view of Ness. And in fact, there's been a lot of infighting within the deep green community between those who kind of look at the deep ecology movement and see the maleness of it, right, and see the same male-female interactions playing out there, and trying to bring that to the table and negotiate it out. But there's also a commonality in the sense, I would place a lot of these together, despite important differences between them, in the sense of saying values matter, and that we have to adjust our values if we're going to make any progress to it. I think one of the interesting things, and just in kind of concluding on eco-philosophy, again, this is just a cocktail party introduction to some of this stuff. There's a lot more on it if you want. I can give you more readings on it. But one is this question of, if you take this notion of this deep ecology notion, you got two different tasks. If you take a shallow ecology notion, if we could get everybody to a shallow ecology, then you've got to say people should be moral, right? People should be altruistic. Is that an easier task than saying, no, be selfish, but have an expanded sense of self? Right? If you're thinking about social change, which one do you want to play on? Do you want to say, no, let people be kind of separate from nature and selfish, but then encourage them to be altruistic? That's option one. Or do you want to get them to believe that it really matters, that it's part of their self if a tree dies? Which of those is a harder change to get to occur? I don't know, but it seems like those are the differences between a shallow ecology of the view, which says be moral, be separate from the natural world, but be moral about it, protect it anyway. And this one which says, no, make the natural world part of who you are, but be self-interested and protect that. And I think both of those are two different ways to the same goal. If you're an advocate, right, which do you push? If you're an advocate who largely cares about where we end up and how quickly we get there and how deep the kind of social change is once we arrive, which do you choose? And I think those are important questions, not that we have answers to, but that you actually will answer, because you'll either act like a shallow ecologist, or you act like a deep ecologist, or an ecofeminist, or a Gaia principle, or a bioregionalist, or whatever it is. You'll act like one of those because you believe in your heart, whether you self-consciously think it through or not, that your approach will build to a better world more quickly than the other. So I think those are things to think about. I think that the bottom line is that all of these involve this shift to just a really fundamental shift in what we value in the world. Okay? And it's a pretty deep shift and a pretty hard shift to make occur, right? I mean, think about anybody trying to convince you to have different views than you have right now. It doesn't happen very readily. Take something you're pretty committed to and imagine me changing your views on anything, right? Not very likely, okay? So and then you think about these, and these are deeply held, not even deeply held. These are so deep we don't even know about it, right? These are so deep we don't even understand how I see the world as separate from me. That's so embedded in who I am as a Western American male, right? I mean, I don't see it's just like, how could I think of the world as the natural world as part of myself? It's like, I can't do that, right? Because that's so fundamental to my sense of everything I've been trained to believe is the world is separate from me. That there's not that linkage that we at least kind of project onto indigenous peoples, right? It's not clear to me whether it was really there or not, right? But at least the notion is that indigenous peoples have this connection, and perhaps they did. But this notion of, in any event, even if they had it, that was culturally embedded. They couldn't imagine how you could be separate from the world, right? So I think to imagine that kind of a value shift is pretty incredible. And so it's difficult. So I think it's clear that if you could do this, this is obviously the right answer, right? If you can make everybody just totally care about the environment, then you don't have to do any of this other legal, political, economic, all this other stuff can just vanish because everybody's just a great environmentalist who's really protecting the earth every day, every moment, all their life, you know, and passing it on to their kids as well, right? So this solves the problem. The big if is, can you get there? And that's the struggle. And equal important, that maybe you could get there, but this is a 100, 200, 500,000, 2,000, 5,000 year process to make these kinds of value shifts. And in the meantime, we may have destroyed the earth, so maybe we better do something else while we're waiting. Okay, do a little bit on the political approach. Largely, I won't do much because it you know, sort of is, the rest of the class is the political approach. Okay. But, I mean, they laid out a general view, but I also want to talk about not just a political, but an international relations approach. A political perspective, and one of the biggest, I mean, I talk a little bit about this sort of, those with power don't have interest to protect the environment, those with interest don't have the power to protect. That's a sort of general one. And then thinking of, more basically about this notion of the environment and sovereignty. Environment and sovereignty, or the environment and the state. And the question is, the real question then is one about what are the effects of sovereignty on the environment and vice versa. Okay, so how do we think about this notion of sovereignty or the state? I mean, what's the standard line about the relationship between environmental problems and states?
States should be able to do whatever they want about their own environmental problems without outside interference.
Okay, so one is to say we should have sovereignty, meaning we should be able to, as we always have as states since the Treaty of Westphalia, we should be able to do what we want within the borders of our own country, right? That it's an internal affair, right? What's the environmental response to that?
That some environmental problems extend beyond a particular state's borders, so it's not just a state problem, it's a global problem. Okay, so that, and even if it's not a global problem, it at least affects the guy next door, right? It could be just a lake that we share with another country, but it's that our behaviors stay within our country, within our boundaries, right? And that's what we're controlling, but the effects of those behaviors, the impacts of those behaviors don't, right? So one is this notion that behaviors are internal, but effects can be external. Okay? And we should even put effects in quotes because let's say in Russia, right? In Russia, Lake Baikal, right? Beautiful lake, or the Aral Sea, beautiful sea that's being destroyed, right? Being just all the water's being taken away, just like we dried up Owens Lake down at the end of California, right? Owens Lake, what used to be Owens Lake, some of you now know as Owens Valley, because there's no lake there anymore. The same thing is happening, we're continuing to do at Tamano Lake, but the same thing is happening a lot in the Aral Sea, where the sea, you can see pictures over the last 30 years of just a sea that was this big, now this big, now this big, now this big, right? I mean, cities that are now, you know, ports that are now 20 miles from the edge of the lake because the lake has dried up. So the question is, should we care about that? Those behaviors are in there, but why should that become an international issue? Why should the Russians not have sovereignty over that? What's the argument? I mean, I certainly think they shouldn't. But what should be my argument as an environmentalist? Oh, come on. So you guys aren't going to do very good on the Hill? about any of these things that are internal problems. I mean, why should somebody else have a say on whether we shove nuclear stuff into Yucca Mountain, nuclear waste into Yucca Mountain? I think they should. Why?
Well, are you looking at like a World Heritage type of argument, or I mean, is it? I guess
one way is to, yeah, in a sense, it's the saying there's effects that I care about because this is our globe. It's not your globe. It's not, you don't have that piece. It's the whole thing, right? The whole, what you do with these various seas, and if everybody destroys any water in their area, right? If we all do that, the globe is destroyed anyway, right? So there are effects, or why should we, I mean, think about what are the effects of somebody killing whales? What are the effects to you of killing whales? I'm sorry, but I know for a fact that none of your lives will be changed at all if there were no whales on the face of the earth, except the three of you who actually go whale watching on a regular basis and really enjoy that, right? But real effects, there won't be. Are there important reasons why they should nonetheless be protected from your point of view? Sure. Because there's this sense of just knowing they're out there. I just think it's a good thing that, and I'm not even a deeply religious person, but I think there's a good thing for keeping as many animals as God put here, for as long as possible. That seems like a good thing to me. And I think we should be able to control what other states do in order to make that happen. So that's, so effects can be quite broad. They don't have to be material effects that we notice. They can be sort of psycho-emotional effects if you want. They can be all kinds of other effects. I mean, we have to figure out how we make this happen, and we might have different lines about this. Many of you might disagree with my view on these things. That's fine. But we certainly shouldn't, at least when we think about this, we should say, well, what constitutes an effect that we should be internationalized? Okay? So one is that behaviors are internal, but the effects can be external. That's one thing. What are some other issues about this relationship between... So, I mean, the standard argument is that environmental problems don't respect borders, right? I wish I wasn't able to find the picture, but I saw this wonderful picture of the corner, a photograph from a satellite of the, and people always say, well, environmental problems don't respect borders, and so that one should kind of expect that environmental problems, that when you look from space, you shouldn't see all those little borders, the borders of states, right? They always say, well, from a satellite or from the shuttle, you can't see borders. No, you can. There's this wonderful picture of the little corner down in southern Mexico, southeastern Mexico, between Mexico and Belize. Wonderful picture. Beautiful forest on the Belize side, completely denuded on the Mexican side. Borders matter because people can control behavior internal to their own state. And the Mexicans are not controlling who's cutting down forests, and the Belizeans are. Right? And you just see this beautiful, I mean, this is the forest cover here. There's trees all over this place, and there's nothing here. It's phenomenal, to think that, so in a sense, the environmental problems don't cross borders, but the behavioral control can, right? And so the degree of control of the behavioral problem can respect borders. And in fact, does. I mean, so the question is I mean, so kind of a picture like that, what does it say to you about whether the state is the problem or the solution? Because that's the debate. This environment is a sovereignty debate. Is a debate about the eroding of sovereignty and a lot of people are saying that's a good thing. Get power away from the state. The state is the source of the problem, and therefore we should get rid of the state and replace it with something else. And I mean, one of the things is what else? What do you give all the power to non-governmental organizations? Kind of move down to civil society? Do you move power up to intergovernmental organizations? The kind of argument that's implicit in a lot of what I push in this class, which is give it to international regimes who control things. How do you deal with that? What does this suggest to you about sovereignty? Yeah, Eli.
That just sort of looks like you could argue both sides right there, where it's like the state's the problem in the Mexico sense, and yet in Belize, the state's the reason why there's forest there or whatever's going on in that state has a really large effect on environmental.
So should we get rid of states? Answer the question.
I think you'd have to look at why Belize is forested. And maybe if there's non-government organizations or environmental NGOs or whatever that is the reason why there's forest there, then maybe get rid of the states and have more environmental.
Very nice answer. One is figure out where, so if we think the state's the problem, then we better, A, make sure the state is the problem. And that this isn't because of that an NGO, otherwise known as a timber company, right? Some timber company went in and did this and didn't do it over there, right? Because, or that these were good trees and these are trees that aren't very good for whatever their purposes were, right? A variety of other things, and it just happened that there was a right angle in that tree growth. But I mean, I think we want to, the nice thing about what Eli's doing is saying, before you move to a solution, you better check that that solution works somewhere. Find out, do NGOs protect things or do they make things worse? Do treaties make things better or make things worse? Diana.
Let's say that the state is the problem and we determine an international regime, is the answer. But then the next thing that the regime decides is that overpopulation is really the root of all evil. Mm-hmm. And so birth control measures are introduced into the world water system. I mean,
yeah,
you have to be careful.
Indeed, right? This goes back to power issues, right? We don't want to concentrate power. In some ways, we like distributed power because distributed power avoids make sure that nobody, when they make a mistake, it doesn't destroy the whole system, right? If we have distributed power, then, hey, we can destroy areas, environmental areas in some areas, but not everywhere. And if we have a global environmental regime that gets it wrong, forget about it, right? Because then if the big, powerful global environmental organization gets the wrong rules, then we've destroyed the whole Earth by the time they're done with it, right? So I think we need to think about this. I think you're raising also important issues about that often we care not just about whether something's protected, but how it's protected, right? That we may really like the fact that China is one of the few countries in the world that has actually got a program for population control. A lot of us disagree with the way they approach it, but from my point of view as an environmentalist, I like the fact they have one. I don't like and I don't know much about it, I don't like the fact that it seems to be fairly involuntary for a lot of people, and I don't quite like the way they're doing it, but it seems a hell of a lot better than not doing it. From my point of view as an environmentalist, I think it's a good thing that China and everybody else in the world limit their population. I don't like doing it just by starving people to death, which is our current approach in most countries, is if you can't afford food, kill them, right? By just not letting them buy food or giving them food when they need it. So they're taking a conscious policy approach. It involves problems. And so I think these trade-offs between what power should we give to the state, how does the state use it, they aren't solved immediately by just moving levels. We don't solve it by just saying, give it to NGOs, and NGOs are perfect in all respects and will therefore make good decisions about everything. So that's, I think, an issue that you have to think about, that there's still processes of control that need to be exercised.
Yeah. From an environmental perspective, would you want to look at everything as a tragedy of the commons? Like, even if, like you're saying about a lake somewhere, so it dries up, so it's just that community that's affected. But from an environmentalist global perspective, do you want to look at everything as a tragedy of the commons like that? Would it really affect?
I would be. I think there's two different. You just touched a hot button for me with respect to is everything a tragedy of the commons, which I don't think is quite the question you were asking. I mean, one is everything a tragedy of the commons? I really think it's important not to see it that way, because I think environmental problems are quite different. That a tragedy of the commons, and we can talk a little bit more about this, but I mean, one thing to think about is a tragedy of the commons. In a tragedy of the commons, everybody's a perpetrator of the problem, and everybody's a victim of the problem, right? That is, take the tragedy of the commons. It's an important distinction, but in the tragedy of the commons that you're going to read about more tonight and that you should know a little bit about, everybody's a potential farmer. Everybody can potentially put a cow on the commons, and everybody gets hurt by how many cows are on the commons, right? Because their cow doesn't produce as much milk. Okay, so that's the nature of a tragedy of the commons. Everybody's a perpetrator and everybody's a victim. But is climate change a tragedy of the commons? Is everybody a perpetrator and everybody a victim? Well, certainly not to the same extent, because people who live in Kiribati and Vanuatu and a bunch of small island states, and the people in Bangladesh who are living on the river don't actually contribute to the problem. They're pure victims, right? They're not perpetrators and they're victims. But so one thing is to make sure you kind of notice that there could be differential. I mean, some of the people in Kiribati and Vanuatu and Tahiti probably contribute a little bit because they burn trees for fuel, for fossil fuel. So they're perpetrators a little bit. But there are problems that are not of that type. The best example I know is the pollution of a river. Right? I mean, think of pollution of a lake, two countries. I mean, you can even do it graphically. Here's a lake.
Here's country X, here's country Y. Tragedy of the commons, right? Especially if both of them have a big factory with a smokestack up here, and they have their water, that's the international symbol for a water pumping station. Have a water pumping station. They both pollute the lake, and the lake has a nice circular current, so everything's mixed, right? That's a tragedy of the commons. They're both perpetrators. They're both victims of this pollution of the lake. There's another kind of problem, though, which is like this. Here's a river, and here's the ocean down here, right? Here's country A. This was country A, and this is country B. Now country A. First of all, if you're country A and you're at the top of this river, aka Switzerland, right? What do? You got a factory and a water plant. What do? Where do you put the water plant? Upstream, right? So you put the factory here right near the border, and the water plant right up here. So you get nice fresh water coming into your water plant. You pollute here, right? And then it doesn't matter where country B puts its water plant, because it's sucking the downstream end of this pipe, right? That's not a tragedy of the commons. It's a very different kind of problem. Okay, so that's just to clarify. And there are other kinds of problems as well. So I think we want to be careful not to think of everything as a tragedy of the commons, because the politics of this are way different than the politics of this. Here, country B always has an incentive to solve either of these problems, right? Country A has an incentive to solve this problem. Country A does not have any incentive to solve this problem. Country A likes the way the world is right now. That's a good thing, right? Okay, so that's an important element. And there's some ways you can think of, this is the climate change problem. These are the developing countries. These are the developed countries. Developing countries, they don't like the way the world is, but they certainly don't want to change. They don't have any incentive to change their behavior right now, right? Because they're worried about today's problem, right? So they're worried about food on the table today. Okay, last. So just, Kari, let me get at your real question, though. I don't think that, as I said, you pushed a hot button on that topic, but should we see all problems as tragedy of the commons? Maybe clarify it a bit.
I'm not exactly sure how to I guess, I suppose just from, I'm not quite exactly sure how I should clarify, sorry, you sort of.
Okay.
Because I see what you mean, but at the same time, I'm not exactly sure how to, what's a better way to put it.
Okay, I think the important point here is thinking about that different actors, okay, in lots of situations, actors are both perpetrators and victims of the problem. And we certainly like this kind of problem, because for this, if we assume or can convince people, even if it's this kind of problem, we might be able to convince them that it's this kind of problem, right? Tell them they're part of the, they're perpetrators and victims of the problem. But if they don't believe themselves to be victims, that may be hard to do, right? So that the reason I put developing countries up here is because developing countries don't think of themselves as victims of climate change. They're victims of so many things before climate change happens that they're not victims of climate change, right? They're going to be killed off by 100 other things before climate change kills them off. But if we can convince states that they're in a tragedy of the commons, then the assumption is, all we have to do is work together, overcome this tragedy of the commons, and we can solve the problem. But there may be much deeper levels of conflict, okay, over environmental problems. So I think we want to be careful about assuming that everything is a tragedy of the commons. Okay, and then I think the question then is, for these kinds of problems, and one of the interesting things, some of the best work on the tragedy of the commons is by Lynn Ostrom. I don't know if you have one of her readings for this. No, but everybody will cite her, and if not, I should put some more stuff on the web for you. Lynn Ostrom at Indiana University has done some wonderful work, and what she's done is said, despite what Garrett Hardin says about the tragedy of the commons, that this is impossible to solve, people solve it all the time, and that it's hard, but it's not impossible, and lots of communities have solved it, and it involves a community. It involves a small community working a problem, okay? That you have people who have preserved commons for managing rangeland animals for thousands of years in the Swiss Alps, fisheries in Indonesia for thousands of years, water irrigation in Spain for thousands of years. They've managed this commons problem, and they've managed it well. So I think one of the issues here is that we have to have some sense of community, and that's what sovereignty breaks down,
right? Sovereignty and nationalism, the notion that we're Americans and you're somebody else, so we don't have to worry about you. Though sovereignty helps break those things down, which are precisely the source of the solution.